Thank you all for being here tonight. We're so pleased to have everybody here, and very pleased to bring you this very special program with Dr. Katrina Phillips. So I want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for all their support and partnership for this History Revealed series. You can check out our website and the Eastside Freedom Library's website. It's on the slide on your screen for more programs and coming up events and all kinds of things. So if you're interested in this book and other books, please check out our other partner Subtext Books. They're in downtown St. Paul and their website is subtextbooks.com. And please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our efforts. And you can find out more about both organizations on our websites. On Monday, October 10th, which is Indigenous Peoples Day this year, we'll have a very special History Revealed program with Linda Lagarde Grover on her two new books, Gitchigami Hearts, and her new poetry book that's just out, The Sky Watched. This will be an online program, so you can see our websites for more details and Zoom registration. As a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off during this program, and you can put your questions and comments in the chat, and Peter and I will read those out for Dr. Phillips to answer after her presentation. And again, this program is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube channels. We would like to acknowledge the sacred Dakota land, Minnesota Makoche. The land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other Indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website, which includes ways which Ramsey County Historical Society pledges to honor the Dakota and other Indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. We are committed to bringing you the stories and histories of all in our community, and we are pleased to bring you tonight's program. In 2022, we are working to bring you programs focused on our series, Making Minnesota, which explores the often untold or forgotten stories, histories, and experiences of some of the worldwide immigrant, African-American, and Indigenous communities that make up this, our most diverse county in Minnesota. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe from the Eastside Freedom Library. And again, thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Robin. And on behalf of the Eastside Freedom Library, I want to welcome everyone who is with us. It's a special treat for me to be introducing Professor Katrina Katie Phillips, who is now an associate professor of history at Macalester College. For those of you who are not from the academic world, associate professor is code for she got tenure. And that's really a great thing. And the first thing that comes after tenure is she gets a sabbatical. And I particularly appreciate that she's taking time away from her sabbatical, from her own work and research and writing, to present some of her work and ideas to us this evening. So Professor Phillips is the author of the book, Staging Indigeneity, Salvage Tourism and Performances of Native American History. She's also the author now of two children's books, the most recent being Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think for us at the Eastside Freedom Library, it's exciting that a scholar would also turn her attention to writing children's books. We think that, unfortunately, the process of miseducation begins very early in the United States, and we're all for heading it off as best we can and appreciate Professor Phillips's contributions. She's also a committed public historian, finding other ways to get her research and scholarship out beyond the world of academia. And that's exciting that she's doing that kind of work as well. So again, as Robin said, please, as questions or comments occur to you, feel free to type them into the chat. We'll be tracking them and bringing them to Professor Phillips after she finishes her preliminary presentation. So I'm going to shut my camera and mouth and turn things over to Professor Katrina Phillips.
All right, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Robin. If we had $1 by this point, everybody said, let me share my screen, we'd all have a lot of dollars. And so, all right, so Buju Nijiwag, Bangi Etagon Inita Nishnabem Edash Ninga Nishnabe Gagiged Ajana, Niminwenda Miyawan Amanungum, Ganuj Ogimakwe, Nindigenous Anishinaabe Mung, Edash Katrina Phillips, Nindigenous Jaganashi Mung, Makwa Nindodem, Minawa Mesklabi Kong, Nimbintage Biigaz. And so I said, hello, my friends. I only speak a little Ojibwe, but I will speak Ojibwe for a little while. I am glad to be here today. Tall Chief Woman is what I am known as in Ojibwe, and Katrina Phillips, or Katie, is my English name. I am from the Bear Clan, and I am enrolled at Redcliffe. I want to thank Peter and Robin for asking me to be here today, and I want to say thank you to everyone who's worked or is working behind the scenes to make this program possible. And last of all, thanks to all of you for spending part of your evening here with us tonight. And so Peter has asked me to talk for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have the rest of our time for questions or a better, a broader conversation. And so I would like to start by sharing what happened in my house a few years ago on Indigenous Peoples Day. And so this was the 2020-2021 school year. And it happened to be a day when our oldest child was learning from home. And his second grade teacher, cheerily welcomed the class to their first virtual meeting. And, she told the class that it was Columbus Day. And she invited the class to raise their hand if they knew something about Columbus. And I know there are several people in the audience who know this child of mine and will not be at all surprised when I tell you that our then 7-year-old shot his hand up into the air and waited for his teacher to call on him. And he said, he's known as the person who discovered America, but there were already a lot of people here. You're absolutely right, his teacher said without even missing a beat. And that's a good reminder for all of us. And then I hear, another little voice coming out of my son's computer screen as one of his classmates goes, wait, so you're telling me that Columbus didn't discover anything? And so I spent a fair amount of time that day reflecting on what our son had said. And I never remembered actually having that conversation with him, but I'm sure it came up at some point in time. Our sons and I are Ojibwe. I study Native history and I teach Native history. So his statement wasn't really that out of the ordinary. But as I kept thinking about this, I kept thinking about my own education in the American public school system and the differences that a few decades had made. And so I am, for better or for worse, a millennial. And so when I was growing up in northern Wisconsin in the 1990s, or as I heard one of my children say the other day, the 1900s, our teachers taught us the names of the ships that brought Christopher Columbus to what we now call the Americas. The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. We learned the now infamous rhyme in order to remember the year Columbus arrived. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. we celebrated Columbus Day every October, just like we colored Thanksgiving turkeys and learned about the Pilgrims in November. And I don't remember any of the particular activities or art projects we did, but I very clearly remember the celebratory nature that centered Columbus. And now that I'm all grown up, and now that my husband and I have 2 kids in elementary school, I'm realizing that there were a lot of things I didn't learn. I didn't learn that there were Native and Indigenous people all across the continent. I didn't learn anything about the Taino, the first peoples Columbus encountered. I never thought to ask how Columbus could discover a land that was already filled with people who had their own languages, cultures, and histories. As a child, I never thought to question why the names of the ships were more important than the names of the peoples who were here long before Columbus bumped into the Bahamas. And I'd also just assumed that Columbus Day had always been a holiday. I'd never realized that early celebrations were more sporadic and that it would take until almost the mid-20th century for it to become a federal holiday. The name itself, the name Christopher Columbus, didn't become synonymous with America until after the American Revolution. And according to the Library of Congress, the first recorded celebration of Columbus Day was organized in 1792 by the Society of St. Tammany, which was also known as the Columbian Order, in New York. And again, this was to celebrate the 300th anniversary of Columbus's landing. And in the wake of that, you have Catholic and Italian communities that started organizing in his name and in his honor. A century later, President Benjamin Harrison issued a proclamation on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's landing, recommending to the people, quote, the observance in all their localities of the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America, end quote. And he also called Columbus the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. On that day, Harrison proclaimed, quote, let the people, so far as possible, cease from toil and devote themselves to such exercises as may best express honor to the discoverer and their appreciation of the great achievements of the 4 completed centuries of American life, end quote. As Lakshmi Gandhi maintains, Harrison's proclamation is notable in that there are no real references to Columbus's life, work, or his nationality. Instead, it was very specific to the 400th anniversary of Columbus's journey and how far America as a whole had come since then. The World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, opened in the summer of 1893 to celebrate Columbus's quote unquote discovery of the New World. Like other World's Fairs that both followed and preceded it, the Chicago World's Fair was an overwhelming display of American technological advancement. More than 27 million people attended the fair during its 6-month run, which included nearly 200 buildings on its almost 700 acres. This was where Wisconsin historian Frederick Jackson Turner would give his now infamous lecture on the supposed demise of the American frontier. This is where Buffalo Bill, whose request to bring his famed Wild West show to the fair had been turned down by organizers, and in what has to be one of the pettiest responses ever, Buffalo Bill sets up shop basically across the street in order to lure visitors away from the glamour and the splendor of the Chicago Fair. It was also where Native and Indigenous peoples were put on display to be leered at, used as lower rungs on the supposed ladder of civilization. As historian Gail Biederman argues, the fair, known as the White City, quote, with its vision of future perfection and of the advanced racial power of manly commerce and technology, constructed civilization as an ideal of white male power, end quote. People who were not white were only given access to the exhibits on the Midway, which specialized in what Biederman calls, quote, spectacles of barbarous races, end quote. Celebrations of Columbus would continue in the 20th century. In 1907, Colorado was the first state to make October 12th a legal holiday. New York did so in 1909, and that year the governor, Charles Evans Hughes, led a parade that included the crews of 2 Italian ships, several Italian-American societies, and several branches of the Knights of Columbus. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt proclaimed the first national observance of Columbus Day in 1934, and Columbus made it a national holiday 3 years later. The designation of October 12th as Columbus Day was due in large part to lobbying by Italian-American fraternal organizations like the Knights of Columbus. Italian Americans dealt with racism and xenophobia across the country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and many believed that more public associations with Columbus would help stem the tide of discrimination and violence. In one of the largest mass lynchings in United States history, 11 Sicilian immigrants were lynched in New Orleans in 1891 after the murder of the police commissioner, and Italians were blamed for it. This was only a year before President Harrison's call for a national observance of Columbus Day, and only 2 years before the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. We also have that history to reckon with here in Minnesota. As Maddie Harper and Peter DiCarlo wrote back in 2018, more than 4.1 million Italians immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920, the highest of any ethnic group in the history of the country. Very few chose Minnesota as their new home, but those that did gathered in 4 main areas of the state: St. Paul, Minneapolis, Duluth, and the towns across the Iron Range. Italians in Minnesota were not immune to the racism and xenophobia I mentioned earlier. In fact, as Harper and DiCarlo contend, Iron Range officials called Southern Italians, quote, inefficient and worthless, fit for but the lowest grades of work in the open pit mines, end quote. The Immigration Act of 1924, which severely limited immigration from Southern Europe and essentially banned all Asian immigration, served as the impetus for the construction of a monument to Columbus in Minnesota. The conversation began at a 1927 meeting of Duluth's Italian Progressive Club, and Italians across the state contributed money to the cause. The project was endorsed by the Minnesota Federation of Italian American Clubs, and the formation of the Christopher Columbus Memorial Association occurred shortly thereafter. The statue pictured here was erected in 1931, the same year that the state proclaimed Columbus Day to be an official state holiday. And so, by considering Columbus the first American, Italians in Minnesota were claiming their place in American history. The presence of state officials at the dedication of the monument was what Harper and DiCarlo call, quote, a symbolic acceptance of Italian immigrants as Americans, end quote. However, that acceptance and claiming of Columbus came at a price for Native people, who were either frozen in time or simply forgotten. The mechanisms of manifest destiny effectively erased the Native presence in the creation of the holiday and the construction of monuments like this across the country. In the early 1970s, under President Richard Nixon, the holiday switched from October 12th to the second Monday in October and was named a federal holiday. Less than a decade later, in 1977, the United Nations Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations in the Americas suggested replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Native people across the United States have long advocated against Columbus Day and in favor of a day to instead celebrate Indigenous resourcefulness, resilience, and resistance. Arthur C. Parker, one of the founders of the Society of American Indians, had advocated for a day to celebrate Indigenous people back in the 1910s. In 1914, the Reverend Red Fox James traveled more than 4,000 miles on horseback, campaigning for a national holiday that honored Indigenous people. In December 1915, he handed President Woodrow Wilson a list of endorsements from 24 state governors. That same year, the president of the American Indian Association declared that the second Saturday of May would be American Indian Day. Hawaii, for instance, now celebrates October 12th as Discoverers Day in honor of the Polynesian navigators. Indigenous Peoples Day itself was first celebrated in Berkeley, California in 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival. While it's not a federal holiday, it's an official state and city holiday across a growing number of places around the country. Indigenous Peoples Day is a celebration of Native peoples, cultures, and languages, and it's a chance to recognize and honor our pasts, our presents, and our futures. And so I am trained as a historian, and for the first few years of my career, I was solidly situated in what we can, for better or for worse, likely consider the ivory tower of academia. I knew a lot of people who were doing wonderful work in public history and things like that, but I never really thought that I would be one of them. Over the past few years, though, there's definitely been a drastic and somewhat dramatic shift in not only the kind of work I've been doing, but also who the intended audience is. I still love the purely academic side of things, but I've been told that I should now also be considering myself a public scholar. The work I've been doing has become both a personal and professional mission, if you will, and much of that stems from wanting to give my children and their friends and their classmates better books, better resources, and a better experience than I had. And so about 5 years ago, I got an email from someone at Capstone Publishing. Their online educational module on American Indian history on their Pebble Go Next site had gotten a scathing, is probably the best word we can use here, had gotten a scathing review from Dr. Debbie Reese on her influential blog, American Indians in Children's Literature. And much of Dr. Reese's critiques centered the past tense nature of the majority of these tribal histories, kind of the way that Native peoples and Native nations were framed solely as relics of the past. There were a handful of references to contemporary Native people, but you had to read the pieces very closely and carefully in order to understand that. And, that's something that would be a tall order for elementary students who'd be engaging with the module. And so Capstone, to their credit, wanted to do better. And so I was asked to write sort of an introductory piece, one that brought attention to Native people in the present. And while I had no idea of knowing this at the time, it was the start of what would become another facet of my ongoing scholarship and research. And so since then, I have written half a dozen additional articles for this module, which is intended for upper elementary students, so grades 3 to 5, and reviewed and edited a handful of others. I've written articles on the American Indian movement, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Change the Mascot campaign, the Trail of Tears, tribal sovereignty, and Wounded Knee. I've also written more than a dozen biographies for Pebble Go Next, as well as aside a handful of shorter biographies for their Pebble Go content collection, which is aimed at more the kindergarten to 2nd to 3rd grade level. And speaking of that American Indian history module, I'm in the process of rewriting the entire module, and we are aiming for a 2023 release of that revised module. And so I've also served as a historical and cultural consultant for them on books like this, Art Coulson's fabulous book, Unstoppable, How Jim Thorpe and the Carlisle Indian School football team defeated Army. I also helped with the book on the right here, Hassan Davis's The Journey of York, the unsung hero of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so I'm telling you all of this. This is not meant as, kind of a live reading of my CV, but, I'd been doing this kind of work with Capstone and I was really enjoying it. I was learning a lot. And 2 years ago, literally about 2 weeks after overhearing my 2nd grader share his thoughts about Columbus in his virtual class, I got an email from one of the editors at Capstone asking if I'd be interested in writing a children's nonfiction book on Indigenous Peoples Day for their Traditions and Celebration series. And I was admittedly excited and anxious and nervous and overwhelmed all at the same time. And, I've been asked before what it means to me or how it feels to do this kind of work. And I'm always honest when I say that it feels like a lot of pressure. Native and Indigenous history has been ignored and overlooked for so long that I want to make sure that I not only get it right, but that I'm doing it in a way that's accessible for the broadest possible audience. And so I wrote a draft of the book. It's only about 900 to 1,000 words. The folks on here that know me are probably laughing at the fact that that's all of the word count I got to work with. And so I wrote a draft of it. I asked my colleagues at the University of Minnesota's American Indian and Indigenous Studies workshop to read it, and their feedback was really instrumental in the final product. They encouraged me to be really upfront about the violence of colonization, to explain why it's important to celebrate Indigenous history and also the history of the holiday itself. And I'm very grateful to all of the folks from the workshop who read it. And I am deeply aware that the book would not be what it is without them. And my editor at Capstone was also wonderful. They asked me to, they asked for my input on the cover images and the images used throughout the book. And the cover, as you can see here, is truly one of my favorite parts. And, yes, I'm a historian. I love me a good black and white photo, but this was not the time for that. This was the chance to show the pride and the activism and the advocacy work of Native people today. And, as I have here on the right, I just kind of wanted to give an overview of the series itself. And you can see it has everything from Chinese New Year to Cinco de Mayo to Hanukkah and Juneteenth and Ramadan. And it was really incredible to be asked to be part of this and to really see that attention to Indigenous Peoples Day that, some of these other holidays have gotten as well. And so within the book itself, in addition to Indigenous Peoples Day, I also make sure to reference some of the other kind of contemporary movements. So looking at the sunrise ceremony that's been held in San Francisco Bay since 1975, the National Day of Mourning that's hosted by the Native Americans of New England, and the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. I mentioned how Native people in Minnesota might gather at the Minneapolis American Indian Center, which is one of the oldest Indian centers in the country, or at the Daybreak Star Indian Cultural Center in Seattle. Indigenous Peoples Day is the crux of the book, right? It's right there in the title, but it was also a chance for me to introduce young readers again to contemporary Native people. And, as we know, there's been a global reckoning in these last few years, spurred on in large part by, as we know, the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. And what appeared to be kind of this like surging tide against monuments and memorials, though, was really the culmination of a number of movements, both nationally and internationally. And few of these struggles are new struggles. They started garnering more attention in the summer of 2020 due to the proliferation of social media and new forms of technology and communication. But their historical undergirding is really powerful and has its own lengthy history that's worth noting. And one of the first instances was when protesters pushed this 1895 statue of slave trader Edward Colston into the River Avon in early June of 2020. And this is a statue that had long been a source of controversy, due in large part to the fact that he made most of his fortune as part of the Royal African Company. The company had a monopoly on the West African slave trade and was known to brand the people it enslaved, a number estimated at somewhere between 85 to 100,000 people, with its RAC initials on their chests. The local council fished the statue out of the harbor a few days later, and it was put on display a year later as part of a temporary museum exhibit. And the photo that I have here, this is how the statue has to be displayed now because it can no longer stand upright because of the damage that was done to it. And you can see, the graffiti on it and things like that. And the conservators at the museum actually preserved it. They made sure to spray the statue with something to make sure that that paint would remain. And, we also saw the reimagining of the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond. And we also saw the removal of the statue of Juan de Oñate in New Mexico, several decades after someone chopped off the statue's foot. And Juan de Oñate is most well known for ordering the brutal 1599 massacre at the Acomo Pueblo. And a few years back, someone painted his remaining foot red and wrote, "Remember 1680, the year of the Pueblo Revolt," on the base. And then, of course, there were the Columbus statues. Members and supporters of the American Indian movement an organization founded in Minneapolis in 1968 in response to ongoing police brutality against Native people in the Twin Cities, pulled down that statue of Columbus in St. Paul. It was one of dozens of statues to Columbus that came down either through protest or in advance of potential protests in that year alone, along with about 60 Confederate monuments that came down in the wake of Floyd's death. And so that's the year, 2020, that I was asked to write this book. And I want to give Capstone credit for their willingness to add this title to that collection. I am grateful for the opportunity to have been able to write this book and to see the wide reach it's had, and that I hope it will continue to have. These can be, and they often are, hard conversations to have, particularly when it comes to the atrocities that Columbus and his contemporaries carried out against Indigenous peoples. It can seem daunting, even overwhelming, to figure out how, when, and where to start integrating these histories. You know, if you work in education, how do you integrate these histories into lesson plans and curricula? And I'm often asked to share ideas and resources around this question. And there are a lot of ways to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day at home, in our classrooms, and in our communities. And a lot of these questions I get come from people in my life who have young kids, whether they're parents like me or whether they're grandparents and things like that. And so I just want to take a couple minutes to plug some of my favorite books and authors and things like that, just to kind of give folks a sense of some of the ways that we can incorporate these broader themes into curriculums and things like that. And so Tracy Searle has a number of fantastic books. Her book, We Are Grateful, We Are Still Here. If you look her up, she's got a boatload of really fantastic books. There's Fry Bread, a Native American family story, which is also a great book. And so, like I said before, I have 2 kids. The younger one is in 1st grade and the older one is in 4th grade. And so they both really love the Molly of Denali TV show. I have friends whose kids also really love the podcast. We've never really gotten into the podcast. Mine are much more about the TV show, but that's also spectacular. Some of the books that my kids have are Brenda Child's Bow Wow Powwow. We've got Cheryl Minima's Johnny's Pheasant, and we have Carol Lindstrom's We Are Water Protectors. There are, again, I'm often asked, what are some things that kids can do in classrooms and things like that? You can teach about cultural heritage like Ojibwe bandolier bags, and there are some fantastic, crafts and things that you can do around that. I also like to encourage people to avoid projects that use feathers or projects that have religious and spiritual components. It's best not to, make dream catchers. It's best if you can buy one from a Native creator. And again, there are so many different ways to do this. It's inviting in local authors or community leaders and making sure to compensate them for their time and their knowledge. And, as Indigenous Peoples Day approaches, there might be parades and festivals or other gatherings that feature Native and Indigenous music and food. And, events like these festivals are intended to bring people together to celebrate the histories and the heritages of Native peoples and places. And this is a time to remember, to reflect, and to honor. And one of the things I really love is that this growing number of celebrations that center Indigenous Peoples Day is really an opportunity to not only showcase, again, Native histories, but also Native people now and also Native futures. And, I mentioned before that Native peoples are still often erased from classrooms and curriculums, and elementary school aged children are often surprised to learn that Native people are still here. And, these suggestions might not seem like much, but drawing attention to Native histories and contemporary cultures helps broaden everyone's exposure and understanding. And so the book came out last summer, and the response to it has been more than I could have imagined. And I will never forget when I posted this picture of my boys holding copies of this book. I mean, friends and family members, people I went to high school that I'm friends with on Facebook, but haven't literally talked to in person since high school, started asking where they could buy the book, both for their own kids, for their kids' classrooms. And one of my favorite stories is that my cousin sent a copy to the media specialist at her kid's school. And the media specialist recorded herself reading it because COVID precautions meant that she couldn't like get to all of the classrooms on Indigenous Peoples Day. And I talked to my cousin a little bit after that, and she was like, all right, you know, I prepped her. I was like, so remember, this is the book that cousin Katie wrote. And, you know, my cousin's daughter was like, all right, yes, cool, that's great. And, you know, it's finally the big day. The media specialist comes in and is like, oh, you know, this is the book that Lila's cousin wrote. And my cousin's daughter goes, what? But, you know, it's been really incredible. I had friends from Montana to Massachusetts who bought copies of the book, and folks at the Hennepin County Library bought copies to give away at some of their events. And this was honestly a turning point for me. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I've been asked for years if I could suggest books and resources for classrooms, and it's something that I've always been happy to do. But last year was different. And so the last story I want to share before we move into our question and answer segment, I want to come back to Indigenous Peoples Day itself. So last year, my boys were in 3rd grade and kindergarten. I emailed both of their teachers at the end of September. I wait until the end of September, all right? I give them the first couple weeks, make sure like everybody knows their, you know, their lunchroom code and things like that. But I emailed their teachers to introduce myself and ask if I could send in some books for both Indigenous Peoples Day and Native American Heritage Month. You know, this is something I've done since our oldest started kindergarten, and both teachers enthusiastically agreed. And so I, you know, loaded up on the books I wanted to send to school. I tried to play it cool when I dropped the boys off at school that day with all of the books, but I may or may not have been one of the first parents in line for pickup that day. And, you know, boys come out, they get in the car, and I was like, so, trying to be super nonchalant, you know, how was your day at school? And most times they're like, yeah, it was fine. Like we played kickball at recess, or like we had French toast sticks for lunch. But that day was different. And so our then 3rd grader said, it was great. And he told me how his teacher had read my book and how his classmates asked, you know, questions about what it's like to be Ojibwe and things like that. And it was one of those moments where he was celebrated for who he was. And he's always been a confident kid. But it really took my breath away to see that in some small way, his childhood was already being shaped in a way that far exceeded my own experiences in elementary school. And my kindergartner, on the other hand, was a little more succinct. He said, it was good. You know, my teacher read us the book you wrote about, there was this long pause, the kind of people that we are. Because again, he was 5, he has a little bit of a lisp. And so Indigenous was kind of pushing it a little bit for him. This book was also recently named a 2022 American Indian Youth Literature Award honor book for middle grade books. And that is not an honor I take lightly. You know, as I said before, it was, I was really anxious to write this book. I really wanted to get it right. But the response that it's gotten has really shown me that this kind of work matters. And, you know, yes, it's not the academic books that go through the rigorous processes that take decades to write. But it's really incredible to see that, you know, as silly as it sounds, that the work I do is in some small way, shape, or form is making a difference, and that it's making a difference for my own children. And with that, I will say Miigwech Bizindawi Nungum. Thank you for listening to me today. And I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Peter and Robin.
Thank you, Katie, Professor Phillips. Thank you so much for that and for sharing the beautiful picture of your two sons. Wonderful. So let us start with what's come into the chat. Betty Green is asking, can the list of resources be sent out? And if you would send them to us, Katie, we will make sure that they're available. Anyone can email either Robin at Ramsey County Historical or me at the Eastside Freedom Library, and we'll share that list of resources.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. And then there's a question from Megan. Can it be argued that named holidays are effective, given how the perception of Italian Americans changed after the establishment of Columbus Day? And she hastens to add parenthetically, she doesn't mean this to be supportive of Columbus Day.
Right. And, Megan, I think that's a fantastic question because, we do see there was definitely a shift, historically speaking, in how Italian Americans were perceived after the establishment of Columbus Day. And you can even look at Thanksgiving, right? It's not really until the Civil War that we start to see this kind of push for this kind of holiday that would, during the Civil War, try to bring the nation together. And I think it is a really important question to ask. And, when it comes to Columbus Day and, Italian Americans and things like that, the biggest thing for me is pointing out that this really visceral and violent response to Italian Americans in the United States is what pushed the creation of this holiday in the first place. And, recognizing that history that's there, and then also trying to understand the nuances of these holidays and what they are meant to celebrate. But no, that's a great question.
I would just add that on December 8th, I believe, this History Revealed program we'll be hearing a presentation from John Andreozzi on Italian immigration to St. Paul. And those of you who are curious about these questions, it'll be a great opportunity to learn more about our Italian American neighbors. I would also add that there is a critical body of scholarship, literature about how different European immigrant groups became white. And so I would say to Megan's question that maybe the Italian Americans didn't get embraced as Italians, maybe they got embraced as white. And maybe that's a mixed blessing. Not so clear that all of that is such a good thing. And I think historians and activists are unpacking those identity constructions even as we continue to do research. Let me grab another, my friend Claire O'Connor accidentally discovered Molly of Denali, a really great show, a bit embarrassing to admit that I really enjoy watching a kid's TV show. Maybe we all need to watch it. Great.
It really is a great show. I mean, my kids love PBS Kids, and there are some shows that they watch where I just have to be like, okay, I know it's great and you're learning things, but oh my God, I need a break from this show. Right. But with, Molly of Denali, it's one of the ones where I'm like, you know what? Watch as much of it as you want. Because because it's set in Alaska. And so as someone who studies, kind of more the continental United States, I learn a lot from Molly of Denali. So yeah, Claire, I'm right there with you. I'm not at all ashamed to admit that I like Molly of Denali.
And of course, we're in this very interesting historical moment where the first Indigenous person from Alaska to be elected to the US House of Representatives has just been elected. And I'm sure there will be more awareness following in her wake. And then we have a question from our friend Jennings. And Jennings asks, were there any things you would have wanted to include in the book, but that you had to cut, either for length or for complexity, given that it was a children's book?
Yeah, so earlier when I said that some folks on here were going to laugh at my word limit, I knew Jennings was one of them. But yeah, there were, I think one of the things that I had to kind of pull back on was doing more history with, the Taino and things like that, because as I started doing, that research and trying to figure out, who are their ancestors, who are their descendants, that rabbit hole was a little too much to include in the book, because I also didn't want to say, the Taino no longer exist, because that's exactly the kind of stereotype I didn't want to perpetuate. And so in the book, I phrased it something like, many people in the Caribbean still have, Taino ancestry and things like that, just to kind of try to do all of that heavy lifting in like 30 words. So, but yeah, it would have, if I had had my way, it would have been about 3 times as long, and then nobody would have read it. So.
And then Judy Woodward, I want to thank you for pointing out that the Andriazzi program is in fact in November and not in December. Thank you. That will be November 10th that John will be joining us. And I really do want to encourage everyone to come and hear what he has to say. Victoria asks, how can we best support Indigenous-led businesses and initiatives in our communities?
So that's another fantastic question. And I think the first place to start is, it depends on where you are. I know much more about the businesses and initiatives that are here in the Twin Cities. I also know a lot about the ones up in Duluth, Superior, things like that, because that's where I grew up. And I also, as a bit of a side note, Betty noted that the Duluth Public Library carries the book. And I just have to say that for the amount of hours of my life that I spent in the Duluth Public Library as a child, this is, it's silly to say that I'm like almost emotional about it, but it's like that library was such a huge part of my upbringing. And so thank you, Betty, that really means a lot. And so for, and to come back to Victoria's question, if you're here in the Twin Cities, Birch Bark Books is one of my favorite places on the planet. Somebody told me this the other day, that when they go to Birch Bark, they only take cash with them because they can't take their credit card anymore because they spend too much money on books. I have not yet reached that level of self-control, but we're lucky to have great restaurants and native craft stores and you know, bookstores and things like that. There are, you know, coffee shops. There are, you know, if you're looking for organizations to support, there's the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. There's the Minneapolis American Indian Center. There are a ton more that I'm missing, but there are a lot of businesses and initiatives here in the Twin Cities. If you send me a message later, and I can probably do a better job instead of just kind of rambling off the ones that are coming to my head.
Great. Well, let me suggest that we turn, Robin, if you could allow people to turn on their videos and unmute themselves. Maybe we can be a little bit more informal going forward.
Yeah, before we do that, I want to thank Professor Phillips for being here tonight, the Ramsey County Library System, and of course, Peter with the Eastside Freedom Library. So again, watch for the videos. Check out our upcoming programs, especially Linda Lagarde Grover coming up. And thank you so much for being here tonight.